About the only people who deny widespread media bias these days are the people who are directly benefiting from it, and that would include progressive activists posing as reporters and the Democratic politicians whose water they carry. But exactly how liberal and how biased is the press? Well, for the answer to that, we'd have to go to social science, and now for the first time in a while, we actually have some real data. A new study from researchers at Harvard University looked at 10 major news outlets and found the overwhelming majority of their coverage of the new administration's first 100 days was hostile. At CNN and NBC, both purportedly straight news outlets, 93% of the stories were negative, which is remarkable, considering that there's no way that 93% of their stories about, I don't know, pick someone, Fidel Castro, were negative. The channel published a story linking Trump ally Anthony Scaramucci to a Russia-controlled investment fund they said was being investigated by the Senate. And yet on Friday, CNN had to apologize to Scaramucci, which they did. They retracted the story completely and admitted it did not meet CNN's editorial standards. And that's saying something. Tonight, 3 reporters who worked on the piece resigned their jobs. At least one of them, a guy called Eric Lichtblau, who was at the New York Times, had worked on another CNN piece earlier this month about Trump. That piece also turned out to be false. Last February, to name yet another example, CNN produced a story accusing Trump associates of repeated contacts with Russian intelligence. That report turned out to be almost identical to a report by the New York Times that Jim Comey called out specifically for being grossly inaccurate. We could go on and on and on.
So headline news facing allegations of media bias. Have you seen this? They aired an interview with a man who rescued a baby from a hot car. I mean, they literally saved this little baby's life. In the original broadcast, this is what it looked like. He had a Trump t-shirt on. He's allowed to wear a Trump t-shirt, just like he would be allowed to wear a Hillary Clinton I'm with her t-shirt. So when the interview re-aired, though, this is what headline news did. Can you believe that? The spokesperson for the network responded to the claim, saying, quote, "It was done in error."
It's been pretty obvious for a while now that the Trump-Russia story is essentially bogus. So why are the other news channels still behaving like the stupid little conspiracy tale is the moral equivalent of the Nuremberg trials? Well, until this morning, we could only speculate, and we did, but now we know for sure. James O'Keefe's Project Veritas released a new video in which a CNN producer called John Bonifield explained the entire deal and admitted the network's coverage was, quote, BS. Watch.
Honestly, you think the whole Russia is just like bullshit?
Could be bullshit. I mean, it's mostly bullshit right now. Like, we don't have any big giant proof.
Then why is CNN constantly like Russia this, Russia that?
Because it's ratings.
Because it's ratings?
Our ratings are incredible right now.
The ratings are incredible. Never mind that the core story is untrue, or that it's a distraction from important events actually taking place in the world, or that maybe most important, it's hamstringing our foreign policy to the point where America's vital interests are suffering as a result. Who cares? It's ratings gold. And that's all that matters. According to Bonifield, CNN President Jeff Zucker actually ordered his reporters to get off real news and back to Russia because, hey, it's a cash cow.
So, my boss, I shouldn't say this, my boss a couple days yesterday, we were having a discussion about this dental shoot, and he's like, I just want you to know what we're up against here. And he goes, just to give you some context, President Trump pulled out of the climate accords, and for a day and a half we covered the climate accords, and the CEO of CNN said in our internal meeting, he said, good job everybody covering the climate accords, but we're done with it, let's get back to Russia.
The CEO?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So even the climate accords, he was like, okay, a day or so, but we're moving back to Russia.
A real news outlet might feel an obligation to explain itself, having just been caught pushing a bogus conspiracy in exchange for more advertiser dollars, but not CNN. Instead, they issued a statement briefly in support of the producer in question. Here's what it says, quote, diversity of personal opinion is what makes CNN strong, and we welcome and embrace it. Of course, diversity. Say the word 5 times and all is forgiven. It's like magic, the progressive equivalent of the witch's spell. The irony, though, of course, is that diversity of thought is exactly what is missing in the American media at this moment. This is over at CNN. And watch how the anchor, this is not an opinion person or a paid contributor, this is the anchor of the show, responds when one of her guests suggests maybe you should be skeptical. Watch this.
CNN reports 2 former officials knowledgeable of the situation confirmed to CNN the main points of the story. 2 former officials. Tell you what, come out, name those people, then we'll have something to talk about.
One, we protect sources. 2, it's not just CNN. It's Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, ABC,
yeah, but who
NBC.
are the sources?
Carl.
Who are the sources? Oh, because they're hiding behind this anonymity.
Oh,
and that's what we're seeing.
Please, do not even start with me that you're just going to attack sources.
Okay, so
that
what about,
is
so are you saying McMaster is lying?
I'm not saying McMaster is lying.
Well, he didn't really answer the question.
He didn't answer the question.
He said nothing inappropriate was shared.
No, that's his opinion.
That would be,
but that's his opinion.
You cannot say, you cannot attack, do not attack the stellar reporters of CNN.
He was making an excellent point, which is the news media today gets to use these anonymous sources, and the anonymous sources can say all sorts of terrible things about Trump, but you attack a CNN reporter, what? They do not want to do stories, for example, about the burden of illegal immigration on the healthcare system. They were very anxious to make sure they don't talk about the burden of illegal immigrants on the education system, our schools. They don't talk about the burden of illegal immigration on anything, on crime. That's all considered like a pro-Trump angle. We don't do that, and they certainly don't do stories like Kate Steinle when an illegal immigrant they've tried to deport several times, murder someone.
The Harvard study found that of stories on Trump's immigration policies, fully 96% were negative. There was more diversity in the Romanian media under Ceausescu. Now, if you've read a newspaper lately, you've seen it. Here's the New York Times, for example. Immigrants hide, fearing capture on any corner. The LA Times. Trump's crackdown sparks fear and anger among immigrants here illegally. And, of course, America's least honest newspaper, The Washington Post, which wrote in a headline, immigrants are now canceling their food stamps for fear that Trump will deport them. Where are the stories about Americans hurt by illegal immigration? Well, you'd have to wait an awful long time to see those.
President Trump drew an X today through the welcoming words of the nearby Statue of Liberty.
Trump has always trafficked in fear-mongering. This time, to stoke those fears and present himself as the country's protector, he chose to punish ordinary men, women, and children who are fleeing terrorism and violence.
This is just a proposal, but already immigration attorneys are telling me it's harsh and un-American.
Fantasies about the violent death of the president seem to be a running theme at CNN these days. Just 2 weeks ago, Kathy Griffin, a CNN host at the time, she did the New Year's show, fantasized about beheading President Trump. A New York production of Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar features a Caesar modeled on President Trump. Spoiler alert, he does get stabbed to death halfway through the play, as he has for hundreds of years. That play was sponsored by Time Warner. That's the parent company of CNN. Fareed Zakaria, who hosts a show on CNN on the weekends, tweeted this: if you're in New York, go see Julius Caesar free in Central Park, brilliantly interpreted for the Trump era. A masterpiece, he laughed, he cried.
When you think about it, Time Warner obviously owns CNN, as you just mentioned. They had the Kathy Griffin situation just 2 weeks ago. They're forced to let her go 24 hours later. They also own HBO, Tucker. And Bill Maher, just 10 days ago, on that program, interviewing a Republican senator, said that he was a House N-word, and he had to apologize. HBO didn't suspend him. I don't quite know why, probably because there's no advertisers on HBO, so there was no threat of boycott. HBO also in 2012 featured a severed head on Game of Thrones of President Bush. Then you go to Reza Islan, who called the president a POS on Twitter. He said a lot worse on there. And CNN releases a statement saying that he's not an employee of the network, even though he hosts the show. So a week later, they were forced to fire their non-employee, and he's gone. Harvard study about 2 weeks ago shows that CNN is number one in terms of negative coverage of Trump, 93% negative. New York Times is number 3, 87% negative.
CNN, in other words, is no longer just a news organization. It is a campaign with a political mission run, not surprisingly, by a man named Jeff Zucker, who once expressed interest in running for office himself.
We're in the most poisonous media atmosphere, I think, that any president, certainly that I, in my lifetime, has ever experienced.
Let me read this presidential briefing. Yep, I got the briefing right here.
There's a level of viciousness that I was not expecting.
The only thing your mouth is good for is being Vladimir Putin's holster.
And if you remember a couple of years ago, there was a clown that in Missouri that wore a mask of President Obama. This is in 2013, I think. And CNN was all over this story. A lot of media was all over it, to the point where not only does the clown get fired, and this clown wore masks of Reagan and Bush and Clinton in previous years. He's a veteran clown, apparently. But he was banned for life from the Missouri State Fair.
Many journalists believe it's literally impossible to be unfair to Donald Trump or the people who work for him.
When he said today, America first, it was not just the racial, I shouldn't say racial, the Hitlerian background to it.
I understand why so many people voted for him. I understand where you were coming from. I understand why you liked him. But this man is lying to you.
Trump's critics, those who are worried about this president and this White House, saw a live special television event brought to you by narcissism, thin skin, chaos, and deeply personal grievances.
This was a white lash. This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president in part. And that's the part where the pain comes.
This is a really sad night. I'm just going to say it. This is a very sad night for the country. You can't polish this turd.
Extremism in the pursuit of Trump is no vice. That's the view in newsrooms, and you hear it in conversations all around Washington, a city that voted 91% for Hillary Clinton last fall. Media figures, adults, smart people who've been around, who have perspective or did have perspective, they don't anymore. They've succumbed to Trump hatred that is so intense it has destroyed their judgment and in some cases affected their character.
You have more people marching against you than cancer.
We don't allow reporters to cover their spouses or their kids. Why don't we? Because they wouldn't be able to see clearly. Their emotions would cloud their judgment. Their love would get in the way of fair coverage. Hate has the same effect on people. It distorts your view of reality. In the end, it blinds you completely. And that's where the American media are right now, stumbling around in a sightless rage, screaming. Someone ought to reel them in before they hurt themselves in ways that can't be fixed.